The mining vessel Frontier Hope drifted through the asteroid belt near Jupiter, like a metal insect searching for precious stones in an endless field of rocks. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his worn command chair and watched the screens show nothing but darkness and distant ice chunks that had been floating here since the solar system was born. He had been doing this job for 8 years now and knew every sound his ship made, every vibration that traveled through the hull when the mining lasers fired up, every smell that came from the recycled air systems when they needed maintenance. The crew of 12 worked in comfortable silence that came from months spent together in the black emptiness of space. Lucy Grant piloted the ship with steady hands, her eyes constantly moving between navigation displays and sensor readouts. Paul Stevens kept the engines running smooth and the life support systems breathing clean air into their lungs. Karen White made sure everyone stayed healthy and patched up the small injuries that came from working with heavy machinery and zero gravity. Danny Price handled all communications with Earth and the other mining vessels scattered throughout the belt. They were ordinary people doing an ordinary job in an extraordinary place. Most of them had families waiting back on Earth or Mars, counting the days until their contracts ended and they could go home with enough money to make the separation worthwhile. Some dreamed of buying houses or starting businesses. Others just wanted to pay off debts and sleep under a real sky again instead of metal ceilings. The day started like any other day in space, which meant it was both boring and beautiful at the same time. Jake drank coffee from a sealed container and reviewed the mining reports from the night shift. They had pulled out decent amounts of platinum and rare earth elements from the asteroids, enough to keep the company happy and ensure their bonuses would be good this quarter. Everything was running according to plan until the sensors started screaming. Danny nearly jumped out of his seat when the proximity alarms went off. His fingers flew across his console as he tried to figure out what had triggered the warning. The screens showed something big had just appeared on their sensors, something that definitely was not an asteroid or another human ship. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he stared at the image forming on the main display. The alien vessel looked like someone had carved it from a single piece of black glass that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. It had no obvious engines or weapons ports, no markings or lights that would help them understand what they were looking at. The ship was enormous, easily 10 times the size of the Frontier Hope, and it had appeared without warning as if it had stepped out of nowhere directly into their space. Jake made the decision that would define the rest of his life, though he did not know it yet. He ordered Danny to broadcast peaceful greetings in every language humanity had ever developed, along with mathematical sequences that should be universal to any species capable of building starships. The crew held their breath and waited for a response, their hearts beating faster as seconds stretched into minutes. Lucy kept her hands on the controls, ready to move the ship if needed. Paul checked and rechecked the engines, making sure they could jump to maximum speed if the captain gave the word. Karen prepared the medical bay without being asked, her instincts telling her that something bad was coming. Danny sent message after message into the void, hoping that somewhere on that alien ship, someone would understand that humans meant no harm. The alien response came in the form of what looked like a diplomatic transmission, a series of tones and images that seemed designed to communicate peaceful intentions. Jake allowed himself to hope for just a moment that they were about to witness humanity's first real contact with intelligent life from another world. He imagined his name in history books, thought about how his daughter would be proud of her father for being part of something so important. Then the Krell opened fire, and all those dreams turned to ash. The energy beams hit their shields with such force that the entire ship shook like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Alarms screamed from every console as the shields collapsed under the assault. The hull began to breach in multiple locations, and the sound of tearing metal echoed through the corridors. Jake shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the chaos of people screaming and systems failing. Lucy tried to pilot them away, but the engines took a direct hit and went dead. Paul ran toward engineering to try some kind of miracle repair but never made it there. The Krell boarding pods attached to the hull with heavy thuds that everyone felt in their bones. Karen grabbed her medical kit and ran toward the injured crew members bleeding in the hallways. Danny kept transmitting everything, his fingers steady even as his face showed pure terror, making sure that someone somewhere would know what happened here. The Krell soldiers came through the breaches like nightmares made real. They were tall and covered in armor that seemed to be part of their bodies. They moved with purpose and efficiency, hunting down every human they could find with weapons that turned people into ash, or cut them apart with beams of concentrated energy. There was no negotiation, no demands, no explanation. They were simply killing everyone they found. Jake managed to reach the bridge console and triggered the emergency beacon with shaking hands. He knew it would take hours for the signal to reach anyone who could help. And by then it would be far too late. The security cameras recorded everything as the Krell methodically worked their way through the ship. Lucy died defending the engine room, firing a welding torch at armored soldiers who barely noticed her desperate attack. Paul was executed while trying to seal a bulkhead to buy others time to escape. Karen was killed while trying to stop the bleeding of a crew member who was already dead. Danny Price was the last one alive, hiding in a maintenance shaft with his heart hammering so hard, he thought the aliens would hear it through the metal walls. He watched through a ventilation grate as the Krell soldiers walked past, saw them taking samples of human tissue and scanning the ship's technology with devices he could not understand. He held his breath and prayed to gods he had never believed in before, hoping they would miss him in their search. Captain Jake Morrison died on his bridge with his hand still on the console, his last act ensuring that the black box protocol was activated and every moment of the massacre was being transmitted back to Earth in a continuous stream. He thought of his daughter in those final seconds, hoped she would understand that he had tried his best. The Krell soldier who killed him did not hesitate or show any emotion, just raised its weapon and fired as if swatting an insect. They found Danny an hour later when their scanning equipment detected his life signs in the maintenance shaft. He tried to fight with a metal pipe, but it was like a child fighting a trained soldier. The Krell killed him efficiently and without ceremony, ending the last human life aboard the Frontier Hope. The entire attack had lasted less than 20 minutes from first shot to final death. The alien ship detached its boarding pods and moved, away from the drifting wreck of the mining vessel, leaving behind 12 bodies floating in corridors that would never hear human voices again. They did not look back or send any final message. To them, this had been nothing more than clearing out pests from territory they claimed as their own. They had no idea that they had just started a war that would reshape the galaxy. The distress signal from the Frontier Hope reached Earth 3 hours after the last human aboard had died. The emergency broadcast pierced through the normal chatter of space communications like a scream in a quiet room, and within minutes every major government on the planet knew that something terrible had happened in the asteroid belt near Jupiter. The security footage came through in broken fragments at first, then in longer clips as the automated systems kept transmitting everything the cameras had recorded. Commander, Lisa Hayes was in her office at Earth Defense Force headquarters when her aide burst through the door without knocking. She looked up from the reports she had been reviewing and saw the expression on his face, knew immediately that whatever had happened was bad enough to break protocol. He handed her a tablet and she watched the footage in silence, her jaw tightening with each passing second as she witnessed 12 civilians being hunted down and killed by alien soldiers who showed no mercy and offered no quarter. The world watched the same footage within the hour. Every news channel on every continent broadcast the massacre, and people who had never thought much about space exploration or alien life suddenly understood that humanity was not alone in the universe and that the neighbors were hostile. The images of Lucy Grant fighting with a welding torch against armored aliens, of Paul Stevens being executed while trying to save his crew, of Karen White dying while helping others. These moments burned themselves into the collective memory of the entire human species. The United Nations called an emergency session, and for the first time in decades, every nation actually showed up and paid attention. Diplomats who usually spent their time arguing about trade deals and border disputes found themselves united by a common enemy they had not known existed until that morning. The footage, played on loop on the large screens in the assembly hall, and hardened politicians who thought they had seen everything felt sick watching. Ordinary people being slaughtered like animals. Commander Hayes was summoned to the emergency session to provide a military assessment. She stood before the gathered representatives of humanity and told them the truth without softening it or making it easier to hear. The aliens who attacked the Frontier Hope had technology that was more advanced than anything humans possessed. They had shown no interest in communication or negotiation, and they had killed 12 unarmed civilians without hesitation or remorse. The attack was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was deliberate and calculated. She laid out what Earth Defense Force could do with current resources, and it was not encouraging. The fleet was designed to handle pirates and the occasional conflict between human settlements, not to fight an interstellar war against an enemy with superior technology. They would need time to build new ships, develop new weapons, and train personnel for combat against an unknown alien force. Time that they might not have if the aliens decided to attack again. But something happened in that assembly hall that surprised even the most cynical observers. The nations of Earth did not retreat into their usual patterns of suspicion and self-interest. Instead, they came together with a unity that would have seemed impossible just days before. The massacre had triggered something primal in the human psyche, a recognition that when faced with an external threat, old grievances and ancient hatred suddenly mattered less than survival. Production facilities across the planet were converted to military manufacturing within 48 hours. Factories that made cars started making ship components. Chemical plants that produced plastic switched to making fuel and explosives. Electronics manufacturers redirected their entire output to military systems. The shipyards orbiting Earth, Mars, and Luna began working triple shifts to outfit the existing fleet and build new vessels as quickly as possible. Commander Hayes assembled a team of the best military minds she could find. Greg Palmer became her tactical officer, a man who had spent 20 years studying military history and strategy. Amy Chen was brought in as weapons specialist, an engineer who had been developing experimental weapon systems that most people thought were too dangerous or impractical to ever use. Tony Blake joined as intelligence analyst, a quiet man who could look at fragments of data and piece together patterns that others missed. The scientific community mobilized as well. Dr. Helen Ross led a research team that analyzed every second of footage from the attack, studying the alien weapons, armor, and ship design for any weakness they could exploit. They worked with almost no sleep, driven by the knowledge that every hour they delayed was an hour the aliens could be planning another attack. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The aliens used quantum communication systems that meant their ships could coordinate across vast distances instantly. This technology was far beyond anything humans possessed, but it also meant something important. The attack on the Frontier Hope was not the action of a rogue ship or a local commander making a bad decision. It was an official act approved by whatever government controlled these aliens. They had deliberately chosen to kill humans as a matter of policy. Diplomatic channels were opened and messages were sent into space, trying to reach the alien civilization and establish some kind of communication. The messages were carefully crafted to show that humanity understood it was facing a more advanced species, but that humans were willing to negotiate and find peaceful solutions. Every message went unanswered, and the silence was more frightening than any threat would have been. Tony Blake worked day and night analyzing the quantum signatures left by the alien ship. He discovered that the signatures created a trail that could be followed back to their source, like footprints in snow that led back to the walker's home. This was the breakthrough they needed, a way to find the aliens instead of waiting for them to attack again. Commander Hayes understood immediately what this meant and what it would require. She developed a strategy that was audacious to the point of madness. Instead of waiting defensively for another attack, humanity would take the fight to the aliens. They would follow the quantum trail back to the alien home system and deliver a message that could not be ignored. It was risky and it would cost lives, but Hayes believed it was better to show strength now than to wait and appear weak or frightened. The Earth Defense Fleet began preparations for departure. 50 warships were assembled, each one equipped with the best weapons and shields that human technology could provide. The ships were crewed by volunteers, men and women who understood they might be flying to their deaths, but who were willing to go anyway because 12 civilians had been murdered and someone needed to answer for it. The flagship was named EDF Vengeance, and Commander Hayes took personal command. Her crew was handpicked from thousands of applicants, all of them skilled and experienced, but more importantly, all of them understanding what they were fighting for. They trained together for 2 weeks, running simulations and drilling until they could coordinate their actions without needing to communicate verbally. The night before departure, Hayes walked alone through the memorial that had been erected for the Frontier Hope crew. 12 names were carved into marble. 12 faces looked out from photographs mounted on polished stone. Jake Morrison, Lucy Grant, Paul Stevens, Karen White, Danny Price, and 7 others whose lives had been cut short by aliens who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. She stood there for a long time, reading their names and studying their faces, making a silent promise that their deaths would not be meaningless. The families of the deceased were given private time to say goodbye to the memorial before the fleet left. Children who would grow up without fathers, parents who would never see their children again, spouses who had lost their partners, they all came and touched the cold stone and cried tears that no words could comfort. The world watched and felt their pain, and that pain transformed into something harder and more dangerous. When the Earth Defense Fleet launched, billions of people watched from the ground and from orbital stations. The 50 ships formed up in tight formation, and their engines blazed bright against the darkness of space. Commander Hayes sat in her command chair and gave the order that would change human history forever. The fleet jumped toward unknown space, following a trail left by murderers, carrying with them the hopes and rage of an entire species that had just learned it was not alone in a friendly universe. The Earth Defense Fleet traveled through regions of space that no human had ever seen before, following the quantum trail left by the Krell attack ship, like hunters tracking wounded prey through an endless forest. Commander Lisa Hayes kept the fleet on constant alert, knowing that every star system they passed could hide an ambush. Every asteroid field could conceal enemy ships waiting to strike. The crew slept in shifts and ate at their stations, always ready to jump into action at a moment's notice. The first week passed without incident, but the journey itself was exhausting. Living on a warship heading toward an unknown enemy wore down even the most experienced soldiers. Greg Palmer walked through the corridors of the EDF Vengeance and saw the tension in every face, the way people jumped at unexpected sounds, the nervous habits that appeared when stress had nowhere else to go. He reported his observations to Commander Hayes, and she made sure to address the crew regularly, reminding them why they were here and what they were fighting for. In the second week, they found the first evidence that other civilizations had encountered the Krell before humans did. A destroyed space station drifted in orbit around a dead planet, its hull torn open by weapons that had burned through metal like paper. Greg Palmer led a team aboard the wreckage to search for survivors or information, but all they found were bodies frozen in the vacuum of space. The aliens who had built this station were humanoid but not human, with 4 arms and skin that looked like it, had been designed for a world with different sunlight than Earth received. The station's computers were damaged beyond repair, but Amy Chen managed to extract some data from backup systems that had survived in shielded compartments. The files were in an alien language that Tony Blake's computers could not translate, but the images told a story that needed no words. The Krell had attacked without warning, destroyed the station's defenses in minutes, and killed everyone aboard. The pattern was identical to what had happened to the Frontier Hope, and it made clear that humanity was not the first victim of Krell aggression. They found more evidence over the following days. Derelict ships floating in the void, abandoned colonies on moons and asteroids, memorial markers left by species that had survived Krell attacks but had lost too many to forget. Each discovery was catalogued and studied, and a picture began to emerge of an empire that took what it wanted and destroyed anyone who resisted. The Krell had been doing this for a long time, perhaps centuries or longer, spreading through space like a plague that killed without mercy. 3 weeks into the journey, the fleet encountered a Krell patrol. 6 ships appeared on sensors and moved to intercept the human fleet, clearly confident that they could handle whatever primitives had wandered into their territory. Commander Hayes gave the order to engage, and the human ships moved into attack formation with a precision that came from endless hours of training. The battle lasted 17 minutes, and when it was over, all 6 Krell ships were destroyed or drifting as lifeless hulks. The victory proved that human tactics could overcome Krell technology. Amy Chen's new weapons had worked exactly as designed, punching through Krell shields with focused bursts of energy that overloaded their defensive systems. The human pilots flew in coordinated patterns that the Krell clearly did not expect, supporting each other and covering weak points in ways that suggested they actually cared whether their companions lived or died. The Krell fought as individuals, each ship acting independently, and that made them vulnerable to concentrated attacks. But the victory came with a price. The destruction of the patrol would alert the Krell to the human presence, and reinforcements would be coming. Hayes gathered her senior officers and made a decision that would define everything that followed. They could not afford to slow down or be cautious anymore. Speed was now their greatest weapon, and they would use it to reach the Krell home system. Before the enemy could organize a proper defense, Tony, Blake's intelligence team had been working around the clock, intercepting and analyzing Krell communications that bounced through quantum channels. The breakthrough came when they realized that Krell language was partially mathematical, using numerical concepts as the foundation for more complex ideas. Once they understood the pattern, translation became possible even if it was not perfect. What they learned from those intercepted messages disturbed everyone who read the reports. The Krell did not see other species as equals or even as enemies worth respecting. Their communications referred to other civilizations using terms that translated roughly as resources, obstacles, or irrelevant. The concept of peaceful coexistence seemed completely foreign to their thinking. They viewed the galaxy as theirs by right and everyone else as temporary occupants who would eventually be removed or absorbed. The attack on the Frontier Hope had not been an act of war in the Krell understanding. It had been pest control. This knowledge changed something fundamental in how the humans viewed their mission. They had come seeking justice for 12 murdered civilians, but now they understood they were fighting for something larger. If the Krell were allowed to continue unopposed, they would eventually reach Earth, and humanity would face the same fate as all the other species whose ruins floated in the void. This was not just about revenge anymore, it was about survival. The fleet pushed deeper into Krell space and the encounters became more frequent. Small skirmishes turned into running battles that lasted hours. The humans lost ships and people, each death reported and recorded and mourned. But they learned something valuable from every engagement. The Krell fought with superior technology, but their tactics were predictable, based on overwhelming force rather than clever strategy. Human creativity and desperation proved to be weapons that technology alone could not defeat. Commander Hayes found herself changing as the journey continued. She had been a career officer who followed regulations and believed in the chain of command. But out here in unknown space with an enemy that gave no quarter, she learned to trust her instincts and make decisions that would have horrified the military academies back home. She authorized weapons tests that violated treaties Earth had signed decades ago, approved tactics that broke every rule of civilized warfare, and accepted casualties that would have ended her career under normal circumstances. The fleet discovered the location of the Krell home system in the 4th week of their journey. The quantum trail led them to a massive network of inhabited planets and orbital stations surrounding a binary star system. Long-range sensors showed billions of life signs and thousands of ships moving between worlds in what was clearly the heart of the Krell Dominion. Greg Palmer studied the sensor data and calculated that any attack on this system would result in casualties that would make every human war in history look small by comparison, Commander. Hayes called a meeting of all ship captains and senior officers. The discussion lasted for 6 hours and voices were raised more than once as people argued about what should be done. Some officers advocated for a limited strike targeting only military installations, hoping to force the Krell to negotiate without causing massive civilian casualties. Others wanted to destroy everything, to make sure the Krell could never threaten humanity or anyone else again. A few suggested they turn back and report what they had found, letting Earth's government make the final decision. Hayes listened to every argument and asked hard questions that forced people to defend their positions with facts instead of emotions. She knew that whatever choice she made would define her for the rest of her life, and would be judged by historians for centuries to come. The easy path would be to turn back and let others make this decision, but she had not come this far to run away when things got difficult. The faces of the Frontier Hope crew haunted her thoughts. 12 ordinary people who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when the Krell decided to clear their territory. In the end, she made her decision based on what she believed the Krell would understand. They had shown that they did not respect weakness or mercy. They only responded to superior force. Humanity would give them one chance to surrender and face justice for their crimes. But if they refused, then humanity would respond with the same merciless efficiency the Krell had shown to others. She recorded a message to be broadcast on all Krell communication channels, her voice steady and her words clear, demanding they answer for the massacre of 12 humans and warning them of the consequences if they chose to fight. The message was transmitted, and the fleet waited for a response. It came quickly, and it was exactly what Hayes had expected. The Krell sent their fleet to destroy the human invaders. Over 300 warships moving out from the inner system, with obvious confidence that they would crush these primitives who dared to challenge the Dominion. Commander Hayes watched them come on her tactical display and felt a cold certainty settle over her. The Krell had chosen their path, and now humanity would show them what happened when you murdered the wrong species. The Krell armada came at them like a tidal wave of metal and energy, over 300 warships moving in formation that spoke of absolute confidence in their superiority. The Krell commanders had fought dozens of species over their long history and crushed them all with overwhelming force and advanced technology. They saw the 50 human ships and assumed this would be another easy victory, another primitive species that would be swept aside and forgotten. They had no idea they were about to face an enemy that had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the EDF, Vengeance, and watched the enemy fleet approach. On the tactical displays, her crew was silent and focused, each person at their station ready to execute the battle plan they had rehearsed hundreds of times during the long journey through space. She thought about the 12 civilians who had died aboard the Frontier Hope, thought about their families watching from Earth, thought about all the other species the Krell had destroyed over the centuries. Then she gave the order to begin the attack, and 50 human ships moved forward to meet 300 alien vessels. The battle began at extreme range with a weapon the Krell had never encountered before. Human ships equipped with experimental railguns fired solid projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, turning simple slugs of dense metal into devastating kinetic weapons. The Krell shields were designed to deflect energy beams and plasma bolts, technologies they had seen from every enemy they had ever fought. But they had never faced weapons that were essentially just very fast rocks, and their shields did almost nothing to stop the impacts. The first salvo destroyed 8 Krell ships outright and crippled a dozen more. Hulls crumpled under impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons. Armor that could shrug off laser fire was punched through by solid metal, moving at impossible speeds, and the Krell formation wavered as commanders tried to understand what had just hit them. Amy Chen watched her weapons perform exactly as designed and immediately ordered the second salvo, not giving the enemy time to adapt or recover. The Krell fleet adjusted their tactics and began evasive maneuvers while closing the distance to bring their own weapons into range. Their energy beams were powerful and accurate, and several human ships took damage as the aliens found their rhythm. But Greg Palmer had anticipated this response, and the human fleet split into smaller groups that moved in coordinated patterns, never staying in one place long enough for the Krell to concentrate their fire effectively. As the fleets closed to medium range, the humans deployed their next surprise. Small drone ships no larger than fighters detached from the main vessels and accelerated toward the Krell formatio. The aliens targeted them with point defense weapons, but there were too many coming too fast. The drones crashed into Krell ships and detonated nuclear warheads that had been modified to maximize electromagnetic pulse effects. The explosions created cascading failures in Krell systems, blinding sensors and disrupting the quantum communication networks they relied on to coordinate their fleet. The Krell formation began to break apart as ships lost contact with their command structure and had to make decisions independently. This was exactly what Greg Palmer had planned for, and human ships immediately exploited the confusion. They focused their attacks on isolated groups of Krell vessels, overwhelming them with concentrated fire before moving to the next target. The coordination between human ships was perfect, each captain knowing exactly where their companions were and what they were doing, without needing constant communication. Human pilots flew their fighters through the chaos, with a skill that came from growing up in a species that had been flying aircraft for over a century. They understood three-dimensional combat in ways the Krell did not, using the debris field and disabled ships as cover, while they made attack runs on larger targets. They aimed for weapon systems and engine pods, crippling ships rather than destroying them when possible, creating obstacles that forced the Krell fleet to navigate around their own disabled vessels. The battle raged for hours, and the space between the fleets became a graveyard. Destroyed ships tumbled through the void, trailing atmosphere and frozen bodies. Debris from shattered hulls created hazards that moving vessels had to avoid. The flashes of exploding reactors and detonating magazines lit up the darkness like a storm of deadly lightning. Both sides took losses, but the Krell casualties were far worse than they had ever experienced before. Commander Hayes refused to give the Krell time to regroup or retreat. She pushed the fleet forward relentlessly, maintaining pressure on an enemy that was beginning to understand they had seriously underestimated these humans. The Krell had expected primitives with inferior technology. Instead, they faced an enemy that compensated for technological disadvantages with superior tactics, unbreakable coordination, and a willingness to sacrifice that came from fighting for survival rather than conquest. After 18 hours of continuous combat, the Krell fleet broke. Over 200 of their ships had been destroyed or disabled, and the survivors scattered in all directions, trying to escape back to the safety of their orbital defenses. But Hayes did not order her ships to pursue the fleeing vessels. She had a larger target in mind, and the scattered Krell fleet was no longer a threat. The human fleet regrouped and moved toward Krell Prime itself, the home world that hung in space before them like a blue and green jewel surrounded by a ring of artificial stations. The planet was enormous and heavily populated, with gleaming cities visible even from orbit and massive industrial complexes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The orbital stations housed millions of Krell civilians and military personnel, forming a defensive ring that was supposed to make the homeworld invulnerable to attack. The Krell had built their capital here, confident that no enemy would ever reach it, and now they scrambled to activate planetary defenses that had never been tested in actual combat. Commander Hayes broadcast her final ultimatum on all channels. The message was simple and direct: surrender unconditionally, face trial for the massacre of innocent humans and countless other species, establish a demilitarized zone around human space, and accept that the age of Krell dominance was over. The alternative was total war, and she made it clear that humanity was prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure the Krell could never threaten anyone again. The response came from the Krell leadership, and it was exactly what Hayes had expected. They refused to surrender to what they still considered an inferior species despite everything that had just happened. They believed their planetary defenses would protect them, that the humans lacked the firepower to seriously threaten their homeworld, that reinforcements from other systems would arrive soon and turn the tide. Their response was filled with arrogance and contempt, and it sealed the fate of millions. Commander Hayes felt something cold settle in her chest as she read the Krell refusal. She had hoped they would choose surrender, had wanted to avoid what came next, but the Krell had made their choice and now she had to make hers. She thought one last time about the 12 miners who had died for no reason, except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She thought about all the other species whose ruins they had found in space, all the civilizations that had been destroyed by Krell arrogance. Then she gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. The human fleet unleashed everything they had. Kinetic bombardment rained down from orbit like the wrath of ancient gods, railgun projectiles hitting the surface with impacts that could be seen from space. Nuclear missiles followed, hundreds of them targeting military installations and industrial centers. Plasma torpedoes burned through the atmosphere and detonated with temperatures hot enough to vaporize metal. The experimental weapons that Amy Chen had been saving were deployed, devices that violated every treaty humans had ever signed about civilized warfare. The orbital stations died first. Human ships systematically destroyed them one by one, ignoring the desperate transmissions from Krell civilians begging for mercy. The stations were turned into expanding clouds of debris and frozen bodies that would orbit the planet for years to come. Then the planetary defenses were eliminated. Ground-based weapons that tried to fight back were located and destroyed with precision strikes that left craters where military bases had stood. The cities below began to burn. Millions of Krell died in the first hour as human weapons rained from the sky without pause or mercy. The Krell fought back with everything they had, but their defenses were designed to repel invasion fleets, not orbital bombardment from ships that stayed safely out of range. Their ground weapons could not reach the human vessels, and their remaining spacecraft were hunted down and destroyed before they could mount any effective counterattack. Commander Hayes watched it all happen on her screens. Tony Blake provided casualty estimates that climbed into the tens of millions and kept rising. The cost of this vengeance was almost incomprehensible, more deaths than all of humanity's wars combined. And it was happening because she had given the order, but she did not tell her ships to stop. The Krell had chosen this path when they killed 12 humans without mercy, and now they were learning what happened when you pushed Humanity too far. The bombardment of Krell Prime continued for 3 days before the surviving leadership finally transmitted their unconditional surrender. By then, the damage was beyond anything the galaxy had witnessed in living memory. The planet's surface was scarred with craters and burning cities, its orbital infrastructure reduced to debris fields that would take decades to clear, and its population reduced by more than 60%. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 50 million Krell, with millions more dying in the weeks that followed from starvation, disease, and the complete collapse of their society. Commander Lisa Hayes accepted the surrender without celebration or satisfaction. She sat in her command chair and read the Krell transmission that begged for mercy, in the same language that had once dismissed humans as irrelevant primitives. The words were desperate and broken, coming from a species that had never imagined they could be defeated, let alone destroyed. She ordered her ships to cease fire and establish orbital control, then began the long process of occupation and reconstruction. The Krell who survived were in shock. Their entire civilization had been built on the assumption that they were superior to every other species in the galaxy, that their technology and their military might made them invincible. That belief had been shattered in less than a month by a species they had considered barely worthy of notice. The psychological impact was devastating and would reshape Krell culture for generations to come. Human forces landed on Krell Prime and began securing key locations. Greg Palmer led occupation teams that dismantled military installations and confiscated weapons, ensuring the Krell could not rebuild their war machine. Amy Chen oversaw the destruction of weapons factories and research facilities that had produced the tools of Krell aggression. Tony Blake established intelligence networks to monitor the surviving Krell leadership and ensure compliance with surrender terms. War crimes tribunals were set up in the ruins of what had been the Krell capital city. The officers who had commanded the attack on the Frontier Hope were hunted down and brought to trial, along with the political leaders who had authorized the massacre. The trials were broadcast across human space and to other alien civilizations that were watching to see how humanity would handle its victory. The proceedings were fair but firm, and those found guilty faced execution or life imprisonment. The rest of the galaxy watched everything with a mixture of awe and fear. Dozens of alien species that humanity had not known existed began sending diplomatic missions to Earth and to the occupation force at Krell Prime. Some came offering alliance and friendship, grateful that someone had finally stopped the Krell expansion that had threatened them for so long. Others came with warnings and concerns, worried that humanity had revealed itself to be as dangerous as the empire it had just destroyed. Commander Hayes found herself dealing with diplomatic situations she had never been trained for. She met with ambassadors from species whose names she could barely pronounce, negotiating treaties and establishing protocols for peaceful contact. Some of the aliens were friendly and eager to work with humanity. Others were cautious and suspicious. All of them were desperate to understand what humans wanted and whether they would become the galaxy's new conquerors. Back on Earth, the reaction was complex and divided. The 12 crew members of the Frontier Hope were honored as martyrs, whose deaths had united humanity and revealed its strength to the galaxy. Monuments were built and their names were taught to every child as examples of innocent people who had died for no reason except being human. But there was also deep soul-searching about the cost of vengeance and whether the destruction of millions of Krell civilians could ever be justified. Hayes became the most controversial figure in human history. Half the population celebrated her as a hero who had protected humanity from an existential threat and shown the galaxy that humans would not be pushed around. The other half condemned her as a war criminal who had committed genocide and stained humanity's honor with the blood of millions. She received death threats and marriage proposals in equal measure and could not go anywhere without security. She retired from military service 5 years after the war ended. But the debate about her actions never stopped. She wrote a memoir that became required reading at military academies and sparked endless discussions in philosophy and ethics classes. In the book, she tried to explain her thinking and justify her choices, but she also admitted that she did not know if she had made the right decisions. The question that haunted her was simple but impossible to answer. When facing extinction, how much of your humanity must you sacrifice to survive? The Krell spent decades rebuilding their shattered civilization. The survivors had to construct not just new buildings and infrastructure, but an entirely new understanding of their place in the universe. The younger generation that grew up after the war rejected the old beliefs about Krell superiority and began building relationships with other species based on mutual respect rather than domination. Some of the older Krell called for revenge and refused to accept their defeat, but they were a shrinking minority that had less influence with each passing year. Humanity emerged from the war transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. The nations of Earth maintained their unity and eventually formed a true planetary government that could speak with one voice to the galaxy. The expansion into space accelerated dramatically as humans claimed systems the Krell had once controlled and established colonies on worlds that had been considered off-limits. Technologies developed during the war led to breakthroughs in medicine, energy production, and space travel that improved life for billions. But the war also left scars that time could not fully heal. The veterans who had fought at Krell Prime struggled with nightmares and guilt about the things they had witnessed and done. Therapy programs were established to help them process the trauma, but many never fully recovered from the experience of participating in mass destruction. Support groups formed where veterans could talk with others who understood what it was like to follow orders that resulted in millions of deaths. The debate about the morality of humanity's response continued for generations. Philosophers and ethicists argued about whether the bombardment of Krell Prime had been necessary or whether humanity could have found another way. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile the massive loss of life with their teachings about the value of every living being. Politicians used the war as justification for everything from increased military spending to calls for strict limitations on the use of force. The Frontier Hope Memorial remained the most visited site in human space. Millions of people came every year to stand before the marble wall with 12 names carved into it and 12 faces looking out from photographs. Parents brought their children to teach them about the cost of conflict and the importance of standing up to bullies. Veterans came to remember why they had fought and to seek some kind of peace with what they had done. The memorial became a place of reflection about both humanity's strength and its capacity for terrible violence. Other species began erecting their own memorials to honor the victims of Krell aggression, acknowledging that humanity had avenged not just 12 miners but countless beings who had died over centuries of Krell expansion. Some of these memorials included human names alongside alien ones, recognizing that the war had been fought for more than just revenge. A strange brotherhood developed between the survivors of different species who had all suffered under Krell domination. Commander Hayes visited the Frontier Hope Memorial every year on the anniversary of the massacre, until her death at age 73. She would stand there alone for hours looking at the faces of the 12 people whose deaths had set everything in motion. Reporters sometimes asked her if she regretted her decisions, and she always gave the same answer. She regretted that circumstances had forced her to make such terrible choices, but given the same situation, she would probably make the same decisions again. The story of the Frontier Hope and what followed became one of the defining narratives of human culture. It was told in books and films, taught in schools and military academies, debated in universities, and argued about in bars. Some versions portrayed humanity as righteous defenders striking back against evil. Others painted humans as vengeful monsters who had committed atrocities. The truth, as Hayes wrote in her memoir, was probably somewhere in between. 50 years after the war, humanity and the Krell signed a permanent peace treaty, at a ceremony attended by representatives from over 100 species. The location was symbolic, orbit above Krell Prime, visible through the windows where the scars of bombardment could still be seen on the surface below. Both sides acknowledged the pain they had caused each other and committed to building a future based on cooperation rather than conflict. The galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. The species that had seemed weak and primitive had proven capable of both incredible unity and terrible destruction when pushed too far. Other civilizations approached humans with respect tinged with caution, understanding that this was a species that would go to any length to protect its own. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy, not with peaceful words, but with the deaths of millions, and that announcement would echo through space for centuries to come. The 12 miners of the Frontier Hope never knew that their deaths would change the course of galactic history. They were ordinary people doing an ordinary job who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when first contact went horribly wrong. Their names became immortal not because of anything they did, but because of what humanity did in response to their murder. Whether that legacy was something to be proud of or ashamed of remained a question without a clear answer. But it was a question that humanity would continue asking itself for as long as it traveled the stars.